What's the one feeling avoidance would rather disappear than express? People with avoidant patterns have extreme difficulty expressing emotions and feelings. They avoid articulating what's happening inside them. They avoid sharing their internal experience, even when they want to. But there's one specific emotion that's even harder for them to reveal than all the others. If you've been close to an avoidant, you've probably seen them express frustration, maybe even anger or stress. But this particular emotion, they'll never let you see it. It stays hidden no matter how close you get. This one remains buried no matter what. Today you'll understand the specific emotion driving avoidant behavior, why they hide it so completely, and how to recognize it in their actions. Avoidants can show frustration when plans fall through. They display annoyance when pressured. Stress becomes visible when overwhelmed. These emotions create distance, so expressing them feels safe. But there's one emotion that triggers immediate shutdown. When this feeling surfaces, everything in their system works to suppress it. They'll change the subject, deflect with humor, suddenly need to leave. This emotion stays buried because revealing it would expose what they absolutely cannot show. The emotion avoidants guard most carefully is fear. Not fear of commitment or fear of intimacy in the abstract way people usually discuss it. This is fear of being truly seen as needing someone, fear of being caught wanting closeness, fear of revealing that underneath all their independence, they actually depend on the connection. This terror of exposing their need for another person shapes every behavior, every withdrawal, every time they create distance. The moment they feel themselves needing someone, fear floods their system, and distance becomes the only way to feel safe again. When an avoidant notices themselves wanting more from a relationship, their entire system interprets this as danger. The desire for closeness registers as vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like potential devastation. Their brain equates needing someone with being weak, exposed, at risk of abandonment. So the instant they catch themselves caring deeply or wanting more presence from their partner, fear takes over. They experience this as an emergency requiring immediate action to protect themselves. The fear doesn't announce itself as fear. It disguises itself as sudden need for space, emphasis on independence, or reminders to themselves that they don't really need this person that much anyway. This is why avoidants pull back exactly when things feel good. The positive feelings create the fear. When a relationship is casual or distant, there's no threat because they're not depending on it, not invested enough to be hurt by it. But when warmth builds and connection deepens, they start to need it. That need feels dangerous. The fear of being someone who needs another person becomes overwhelming. So they create distance to prove to themselves they don't actually need the connection. The better it gets, the scarier it becomes. Because good relationships create attachment, and attachment means dependency, and dependency triggers the fear they cannot tolerate. Watch for the specific moments when this fear drives withdrawal. An avoidant has a meaningful conversation where they share something real, and the next 3 days they're barely reachable. They spend a weekend together that feels natural and connected, and suddenly they need extensive alone time. They open up emotionally more than usual, and immediately after they become busy with work projects that demand all their attention. The pattern is consistent because the fear responds to the same trigger every time, which is their own growing attachment. The closer they feel, the more terrified they become of that closeness, and distance becomes the automatic response to manage the fear. The fear also shows up in how avoidants talk about relationships in general. They speak about independence as if it's a personality trait rather than a defense system. They'll say they've always been self-sufficient, they've always needed a lot of space, they've always been fine on their own. This language protects them from acknowledging the fear underneath. If independence is just who they are, then there's no fear to examine. If needing space is simply their nature, then there's no terror of dependency to confront. The way they frame their needs obscures the emotion driving those needs. They present distance as preference rather than protection from the fear of being seen as someone who depends on another person. During conflicts or difficult conversations, the fear becomes more visible, even as they try to hide it. They shut down not because they don't care, but because caring feels too exposing. They go quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because saying what they really feel would reveal how much the relationship matters. They withdraw not because they want distance, but because staying present while feeling so much need feels unbearable. The silence and distance are protection from the fear of being seen as someone who depends on this connection. Every time they go quiet during an important conversation, fear is operating beneath the surface, pushing them into shutdown mode to avoid exposing their need. Understanding that fear is the hidden emotion explains why avoidants struggle so much with receiving care or support. When someone offers help, brings them something when they're sick, or shows up for them in tangible ways, the avoidant often responds with discomfort or dismissal. This isn't ingratitude, it's fear. Accepting care means acknowledging they needed it, which means admitting dependency. The fear of being seen as someone who needs support makes them reject the very things that would help them feel more secure. They'd rather struggle alone than risk exposing the need that accepting help would reveal. Watch how an avoidant responds when they're going through something difficult. They become even more independent. They handle everything alone. They insist they're fine when they're clearly struggling. They refuse offers of help and minimize their problems. This isn't strength or self-sufficiency. It's fear of revealing that they can't do everything alone. Fear of showing that they could use support. Fear of being caught needing someone to be there for them. The harder things get, the more the fear pushes them into isolation, because isolation feels safer than the vulnerability of needing someone. The fear also drives their approach to planning and future talk. Avoidants resist making plans too far in advance or discussing long-term possibilities because these conversations require acknowledging they want the person in their future. Admitting they're planning around someone, thinking about a future together, or counting on this connection all expose their need for it to continue. The fear of revealing that level of investment keeps them vague about the future, non-committal about plans, and resistant to conversations about where the relationship is heading. Every time someone tries to discuss the future, the fear gets triggered because future talk requires admitting the relationship matters enough to plan around. When avoidants end relationships, the fear is often what's really driving the decision. They'll frame it as incompatibility, or wrong timing, or needing different things, but underneath these explanations is terror. They've felt themselves needing the person too much. They've caught themselves depending on the connection more than feels safe. The fear of being truly attached, truly vulnerable to loss, becomes so intense that leaving feels like the only way to escape it. Ending things gives them back control and eliminates the danger of being someone who needs another person. The relationship could be healthy, the partner could be wonderful, but if the fear becomes overwhelming enough, they'll leave to protect themselves from their own need. The physical experience of this fear shows up in their bodies during moments of intimacy or emotional closeness. They feel tension, restlessness, an urge to move or leave. Their chest might feel tight. They experience discomfort that they can't quite name. This bodily response is the fear manifesting as sensation rather than conscious thought. The physical discomfort pushes them to create distance without them necessarily recognizing they're afraid. They just know they need space, need air, need to be alone. The body's response to the fear drives behavior before conscious awareness catches up. Avoidants often describe feeling trapped or suffocated in relationships, and this language reveals the fear operating beneath the surface. They're not actually trapped. The relationship isn't actually suffocating them. What feels suffocating is their own growing need for the person. What feels like a trap is their increasing emotional investment. The fear of dependency gets projected onto the relationship itself, making closeness feel like confinement rather than connection. When they say they need space to breathe, what they often mean is they need distance from their own feelings of need. Distance from the fear that arises when they realize how much they're starting to depend on someone. The way avoidants handle this fear affects their partners significantly. When someone is close to an avoidant, they often feel confused by the inconsistency. The avoidant seems interested one day and distant the next. They initiate closeness and then retreat from it. They show care in actions, but resist expressing it in words. This inconsistency isn't manipulation or game playing. It's the avoidant moving between their genuine desire for connection and their fear of needing it. The back and forth reflects their internal battle between wanting closeness and being terrified of depending on it. Every time they pull back, fear is winning that internal battle. Partners of avoidance frequently blame themselves for the distance, wondering what they did wrong or how they pushed the person away. But the fear operating in avoidance isn't about their partner's behavior. It's about their own internal experience of need. An avoidant can pull away from the kindest, most understanding partner because the fear isn't responding to how they're being treated. It's responding to how much they're starting to need the person. The better things are, sometimes the more frightening it becomes, because good relationships create stronger attachment, and stronger attachment means more dependency to fear. The partner could be doing everything right, and the avoidant would still pull away because the fear is about internal experience, not external circumstances. Recognizing this fear in action means watching for how it disguises itself. Fear rarely announces itself directly in avoidance. Instead, it shows up as sudden emphasis on career goals that require all their focus. It appears as remembering how much they value their alone time. It manifests as feeling overwhelmed by how much time they're spending together. It emerges as irritation about minor things that didn't bother them before. All these surface explanations mask the deeper fear driving the need for distance. When an avoidant suddenly becomes focused on anything that creates space, fear is likely operating underneath, pushing them away from connection that's starting to feel too necessary. The practical way to respond to this fear, when you recognize it operating, is to reduce the pressure around emotional expression while maintaining steady presence. Avoidants need to see that showing need doesn't lead to abandonment or judgment. They need evidence that depending on someone is safe. This happens through consistent, calm presence that doesn't demand they prove their feelings or explain their withdrawals. When they pull back, staying steady without chasing or punishing teaches their system that closeness doesn't equal danger. The fear loses power when reality contradicts what the fear predicts, which is that showing need leads to pain. Avoiding constant conversations about the relationship also helps. Every time someone sits an avoidant down for a serious talk about where things are going or how they're feeling, it activates the fear. The avoidant experiences this as being forced to admit their need, which feels like exposure. Instead of frequent relationship talks, focus on building safety through actions. Show up consistently. Be reliable without being demanding. Create space for them to move toward you at their own pace. This reduces the fear gradually because they start to experience depending on someone without catastrophe following. Actions teach their system what words cannot, which is that need doesn't automatically lead to abandonment. When an avoidant does share something vulnerable, the response matters enormously. Making a big deal out of it, pointing out that they're finally opening up, or expressing relief that they're showing emotion all backfire. These responses confirm their fear that showing need is a big deal, something noteworthy, something that makes them different or weaker. Instead, receive vulnerability casually. Respond to what they shared, not to the fact that they shared it. Treat their openness as normal rather than as a breakthrough. This shows them that expressing emotion doesn't change how you see them, which slowly reduces the fear that vulnerability will lead to judgment or rejection. The fear never fully disappears, but it becomes more manageable when avoidants experience relationships where need doesn't lead to pain. Each time they lean in slightly and nothing bad happens, the fear loses a bit of power. Each time they show vulnerability and receive calm acceptance, their system learns that dependency might not be dangerous. This process is slow because the fear runs deep, but it progresses through repeated experiences of safety rather than through conversations about feelings. The brain learns through experience, not through intellectual understanding, so creating safe experiences matters more than talking about the fear directly. Changing this pattern requires avoidance to build tolerance for the fear itself rather than always acting on it. When the urge to create distance comes up, pausing instead of immediately withdrawing helps. When the fear of needing someone surfaces, staying present with that discomfort instead of running teaches the system it can handle vulnerability. This is internal work that happens slowly through repeatedly choosing not to distance when every instinct says to protect themselves through withdrawal. Each time an avoidant stays present despite the fear, they build capacity to tolerate the discomfort of needing someone. For avoidants willing to work on this fear, small steps matter more than dramatic changes. Staying in a conversation 5 minutes longer than feels comfortable builds capacity. Accepting one offer of help instead of refusing everything creates new neural pathways. Sharing one vulnerable thought instead of keeping everything locked inside teaches the brain that expression doesn't equal disaster. These tiny moments of tolerating the fear, of not immediately acting on the impulse to distance, gradually reshape how the system responds to closeness. Progress happens through accumulation of small experiences rather than through sudden transformation. The fear also connects to how avoidants handle their own emotional needs. They've learned to suppress what they want, to minimize what they feel, to convince themselves they don't need much from anyone. This suppression isn't conscious choice or deliberate strategy. It's automatic protection against the fear of having needs that might not be met. If they don't acknowledge needing something, they can't experience the terror of depending on someone else to provide it. The emotional shutdown serves the fear by eliminating the vulnerability of wanting anything from another person. By not having needs, they protect themselves from the fear of those needs going unmet. Recognizing when someone is operating from this fear versus when they genuinely need space requires attention to context and timing. Genuine need for alone time doesn't follow patterns of withdrawal after closeness. Real preference for independence doesn't intensify specifically when attachment deepens. Authentic desire for autonomy doesn't create physical discomfort during intimate moments. When the need for distance consistently appears right after connection, right after vulnerability, right after experiences that would naturally increase attachment, fear is likely driving the behavior rather than actual preference for space. The fear manifests differently depending on how conscious the avoidant is of their patterns. Some avoidants have no awareness that fear is operating. They genuinely believe they simply prefer independence, need lots of space, and function better with distance. The fear runs so deep and has operated for so long that it feels like personality rather than protective response. Other avoidants have some awareness that something deeper is happening, that their withdrawal isn't really about being busy or needing alone time, but they still can't stay present with the discomfort long enough to change the pattern. Awareness alone doesn't eliminate the fear, but it's often the first step toward working with it differently. Understanding this fear doesn't mean excusing hurtful behavior or accepting treatment that doesn't work for you. An avoidance fear explains their actions but doesn't obligate anyone to tolerate distance, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability that leaves them feeling insecure. The fear is real, the struggle is genuine, but relationships require both people to show up and understanding. Someone's internal experience doesn't mean sacrificing your own needs to accommodate their limitations. You can understand the fear and still choose not to stay in a relationship where that fear prevents real connection from developing. For people in relationships with avoidance, knowing about this fear helps with not taking the withdrawal personally. The distance isn't rejection. The need for space isn't about you being too much or doing something wrong. The emotional shutdown isn't indifference. These behaviors are protective responses to internal fear that has nothing to do with your worth or the actual health of the relationship. This understanding can reduce the anxiety that comes from constantly wondering if you caused the distance or if the person actually cares. The fear explains behavior that otherwise feels confusing or hurtful. The hidden emotion of fear shapes everything about how avoidants approach relationships, from the initial stages through long-term connections. It determines when they pull back, what they can't express, how they respond to care, why they resist vulnerability, and ultimately whether they can stay in relationships that require them to acknowledge need. The fear remains hidden because exposing it would mean admitting the very dependency they're terrified of revealing. As long as the fear stays buried, they can maintain the illusion of complete self-sufficiency, but the cost is genuine intimacy and the security that comes from being truly known by another person. If you've recognized these patterns in someone close to you, understanding that fear is the driving force changes how you interpret their behavior. The withdrawal after good times isn't punishment. The resistance to vulnerability isn't lack of feeling. The emphasis on independence isn't rejection of you. These are all protective responses to a fear so deep that it shapes their entire approach to connection. Whether the relationship can work depends on whether the avoidant is willing to work with their fear rather than always letting it control their choices, and whether you're willing to maintain your own needs while they navigate that process. Leave a comment sharing your experience with avoidant patterns. Have you seen this fear operating in someone's behavior? How did you respond when you recognized what was really happening? Like this video if understanding the hidden emotion helped clarify patterns you've been observing. Subscribe for more content on attachment patterns and relationship dynamics. Thanks for watching.